Hello, and welcome to episode 37 of Libero, the podcast about the least important of the least important things, as the notorious B.I.G. once said. I'm Rory Smith of The Observer and Men in Blazers, and today I'm joined by Jonathan Wilson, who you may know from such productions as Behind the Curtain and Wilson's World. It's party time, it's excellent. And John Brewin, largely but not exclusively of The Guardian. Today we're starting a two-part mini-series, The Last Resort of the Damned, on the malaise of the modern Manchester United. Mark Ogden, our friend of all of us from ESPN, did a piece along these lines a while ago and described United as being too big to fail, which is both a good way to think of them and also quite funny because that was at least a year ago and they've got much worse. We're going to start out by channeling our inner Gibbon and examining the reasons for the decline and fall of this particular empire. And then we'll finish today by discussing the broader phenomenon of clubs getting stuck in this sort of fog of mediocrity, where you get the sense that they can't quite see their way through the problem. Maybe that's not quite the best metaphor. We'll find out what the best metaphor is. And then on Friday, I think Miguel, James, and maybe Tarek, or possibly Jack, will look at how United get out of it, and they'll put it into context of the other major teams going through similar stuff elsewhere across Europe. I have a feeling their conclusion will be that United is the most extreme example, but that's up to them. But given that we've got a historian of Manchester United and a lifelong fan here, those are two separate people, let's try and pinpoint when exactly United kind of went wrong. John, I would go back to 2013 in my own personal kind of assessment of it. Where would you start? I have a feeling you'd prefer a deeper cut.
Yeah, I would go much further back, and you would almost go further back to the club's first golden era, first post-war golden era. I know Jonathan will start talking about Ernest Mangle or whatever.
Which war, John? Which war?
And of course, which war? There's several books written contemporaneously about the decline of Manchester United post Sir Matt Busby, post Sir Matt Busby's reign as manager. And there's Geoffrey Green, and there's Eamon Dunphy, and at the heart of Manchester United is, without Busby's leadership, there was an emptiness at the club. There was a lack of, let's say, moral fibre, but there was this. It was a listing ship back then, and what we're seeing is reminiscent of that. And the idea that you always got, particularly through Eamon Dunphy's account, is that those people that came in as a manager were strangers to the club, that became isolated. And it's the same pattern we've seen every time that Manchester United have had a manager this time. It's something, there's a fault line at the heart of Manchester United that means that you need the great man to come in and to revive the club, as Busby did, after the Second World War when Old Trafford had been bombed, as Sir Alex Ferguson did. Now, the thing with Ferguson is, by the time we get to 2013 and he's replaced by David Moyes, what you've got is a manager whose methods are based on those from the 1950s and the 1960s, but he himself has modernised. But has everybody gone with him? Has the rest of the club gone with him? Is he relied on too much? And then you've got the business side of the club. Ferguson's success was coupled with a merchandising operation. Edward Friedman is the guy who is behind that, who's this whiz kid guy that decided that you could sell a Ryan Giggs bedspread in Malaysia, in Thailand, and it would sell, and you could make money that way. But perhaps where the decline of the club set in from a business aspect is when it floated on the stock exchange. That's 1991. And other clubs at the time floated on the stock exchange. Spurs was one, Millwall was another. And what that meant was that for big businessmen who suddenly realised after the dawn of the Premier League that football was a business to make money from, United became a sitting duck for these people. So at first you had Rupert Murdoch making his move in 1998, one of which Ferguson, well, not speaking particularly publicly against, was against. And then you've got the Glazer move in 2004-05. But if you look at the people that own big shares in the club around that time, you've obviously got the Cubic Expression people who are John Magnier and JP McManus, the Irish racehorse owners who are involved in the club before the Rock of Gibraltar thing, but get even more involved as a result of this crisis, this fallout with Ferguson. You've got people like Harry Dobson, who I think is a mining billionaire. You've got Dermot Desmond, who I think who is a Celtic major shareholder these days. And then you've got the Glazer family, who spot this opportunity. Joel Glazer, the driver of this. And that's when... But the fact that the club was floated on the stock exchange to make money for the Edwards family that owned it, that's when the club became vulnerable. That's when the club fell the way of the Glazers. Now, there is one of the things about some big Man United fans is that they've never forgiven Ferguson for going with the Glazers. But his argument, and I think this is slightly borne out by what's happened since Sir Jim Ratcliffe came in, was that if I kick up against this and I go, so many people at the club will lose their job. But what happened was Ferguson stayed. Manchester United was a sort of thriving community within itself. Like you hear tales from, I'm from Cheshire, hear tales that as well as people working at the club, they'd have little side deals where it would be, someone's moving in, they've got a new player in. Okay, we've found an estate agent. We'll find people have businesses to work with the club. It all worked well. It was its own community. When Ferguson left, that was slowly stripped away. And then, as we've gone on, the Glazers have taken more money out of it. The money that to try and achieve success is more and more. And then Manchester United have dropped away from that point on with the failure of several managers. But at the heart of it, those managers are isolated because United has that emptiness, that loneliness as a manager. It's a very lonely position, as Van Gaal, as Mourinho, remember him living in that hotel, would all tell you. Is Manchester United a doomed club despite all its success? Perhaps so.
So would you'd then maybe trace it back to the floating on the stock exchange of 91, then leading up to like Rock of Gibraltar, which is the other big kind of turning like inflection point people talk about. Jonathan, where would you put it?
But I think there's a whole series of things. So I think this point John makes about them being a doomed club, I mean, obviously that's a ludicrous concept, and yet it appears true in that since 1909, Manchester United have had the biggest stadium in the country, and that gives you an enormous financial advantage, and yet they've only ever won the league under three managers. The most successful team in English football history, English league history, has only won the league under three different people. Under Ernest Magnell, under Matt Busby, under Alex Ferguson. So United have won the league 20 times. Liverpool have won the league 20 times. Do you know how many managers Liverpool have won the league under? Is it just as a point of comparison?
8.
Not a bad guess. John?
9.
10. So
Right, there you go.
Watson,
Ballpark.
Ashworth, McQuinn, Kay, Shankly, Paisley, Fagan, Dalglish, Klopp, Schlott. So three managers is... You can say on the one hand Manchester United are the most successful team in English history, or joint in terms of a league with Liverpool, but on the other hand you can say their history is characterised by huge periods of failure, and then every now and again you get an unbelievably gifted, strong manager. And whether Magnell quite fits that, I'm not sure, because obviously that's very early, only wins 2 titles. But Busby and Ferguson, two of the greatest managers of all time, are needed to sort of put the harness on this wild horse and get it pulling in the right direction. And that is something that is so consistent that it's very hard to say that's... I mean, we had that conversation many episodes ago. We talked about the DNA of a club. That is Manchester United DNA, is actually being wildly unsuccessful in very entertaining ways until they get these great... I mean, the horse metaphor, I guess, works. You get these great jockeys who kind of... who can handle these horses. But of course, a horse then is what leads to the modern decline, because it is Rock of Gibraltar. That Magnum and McManus, and I hate to plug my other work, but we did do a very good podcast on this with David Walsh on It Was What It Was. And David Walsh tells the story incredibly well. He's researched that more than anybody else. He's spoken to more people involved than anybody else has. So if you're fascinated by that, do listen to that. But fundamentally, there's these two Irish horse race owners who quite like being seen with Alex Ferguson. Alex Ferguson gives them prestige and credibility. It's good for their brand. They like football. They get involved in Manchester United, and then they have this cataclysmic falling out over the extent to which Ferguson owns this horse, Rock of Gibraltar. The Ferguson thinks he has a 50% share, which is actually what's registered on the ownership forms at Weatherby's, but they apparently had never quite meant that. There's all kinds of legal battles over it. They end up leaving the club, and they'd leaked 100 questions to the, I can't remember, was it the Daily Mail or the Mail on Sunday? 99 questions.
It's 99 questions, and obviously the 100th is left unsaid, I think was sort of the point of that. I mean, the thing with it, it's an interesting that, guess who backed Rock of Gibraltar? Rock of Gibraltar won the 2,000 guineas at half-time during the Arsenal-Chelsea 2002 FA Cup final. You know, the Ray Parlour final, as we should always call it. Yeah, I backed that horse, and it won well, and I spent that evening, a writer's evening, in which me and a mate sang "Every Single One of Us Loves Alex Ferguson" down the phone at each other, having won on this race. That turned out to be ill-fated, didn't it? But yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that. I mean, it's interesting actually that idea that Magna and J.P. McManus needed Ferguson for credibility in racing. It would sort of be the other way around. It would almost be like Ferguson needed friends like that in the racing game to be credible within himself. It's that if you follow racing, these are sort of major figures in the game. So.
Sure, but they gave him a credibility outside of racing.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But it's one of those things that, like, successful people, in inverted commas, attract each other, don't they?
It was a mutually beneficial relationship. They both gained from the other's prestige in their own industries.
Yeah. But it turned quickly Libero. Because... Well, quite, yes.
So far.
One of the things that McManus and McMahon found that when they turned against Ferguson, that the Manchester United support was at that point pretty militant. Remember that there was the horses, there were demonstrations against them by this sort of fan group that was called the Manchester Education Committee, a sort of very shadowy group, and this was the build-up where, you know, you realise that anyone that tried to take over the club would be faced with this, you know, Men in Black of the Manchester United hooligan firm, and that's how it proved. That time in the club's history is incredible, really, because of all the hoo-ha that went on. There's a famous incident where the one where Ferguson talks about how he would lose people's jobs if he left the club. Is that took place, I think, at United played a Champions League qualifier, I think against Zalaga Zegezeg of Jonathan's beloved Hungary, and at the airport he ran into some fans, and they started saying, well, what's going on with this deal, why have you backed it, and all this type of thing, and he said, you know, F off and support Chelsea, you know, and so this Ferguson, amongst the real, like, hardcore Reds, has never been forgiven for that. And of course, you have all this stuff with the FC United breakaway, and you know, we moved later in that decade towards the, you know, what some Liverpool fans would call the Norwich City Scarves, the green and gold protest, which is, you know, you give the original spirit of Newton Heath, and you fight against the Glazers by that way, and the idea of the Red Knights, these big Mancunian businessmen that were going to buy out the Glazers. Funny enough, talking of racing, I once sat next to a couple of those at Cheltenham just by chance and got chatting to them over that. It's that sort of business world. And the thing is that what threw a fig leaf over that was that actually after 2006, Ferguson was just as successful as he had been before when the Glazers were in charge. And people didn't realise that, or people thought that it would last forever. But of course, it was only going to last for as long as Ferguson was involved.
So we should just explain to people that as a result of this falling out between McManus and Ferguson, they end up selling, it was a 29-point-something% of the club. They sell it to the Glazers. It's a leverage buyout, which football, certainly in England, had never known before.
Yes.
I mean, they apparently were stunned when they came in and found that this club, this multi-million-pound business, was being run essentially as you would run a sort of small family business. No debt at all. You know, it's very, very ripe for that kind of takeover. And then, as you alluded to earlier, John, they've taken money out of the club in dividends. There's huge interest repayments because the debt was loaded onto the club to fund the takeover. And I think there's two almost contradictory things going on there. So they have taken enormous amounts of money out of the club, and clearly, if the club had that money, it would be in a better state now. But at the same time, because a lot of the business operations of the club, certainly up until a decade ago, maybe even after that, were actually very successful. They were making so much money that they have put huge amounts of money into transfers. So I asked on Substack last week, who was the last signing who got better at United? And you can make case for Bruno Fernandes or Diego Dalot or maybe Amad Diallo. But really, to get a player whose level notably raised at United, who wasn't like a kid coming in, you've got to go back to 2011 and the week when they signed David De Gea and Ashley Young. That's 68 players ago, in which time it's spent £1.75 billion on transfer fees alone. So there has been money spent. It's just the money has been spent astonishingly badly. And that, I think, is why 2013 remains the big break, because Ferguson was able, the fig leaf, as you called it, Ferguson's expertise was able to cover over a lot of the problems. Once his expertise goes, David Gill leaves as CEO at the same time. There is nobody in that club who understands how football works. And there is absolutely no consistency of planning. And even though a lot of the players they've brought in are good players, none of them play well for United because the culture of the club, the lack of direction, the sort of toxicity of the atmosphere drags everybody down.
The thing is about this, the Ferguson, let's call it magic or whatever, is that it was done the old way. It was done, it was ideas written on the back of his Daily Express. It was ideas in his own head. It was practices learned from maybe, knowing Jock Stein, from knowing Matt Busby. It was knowing those ideas. But by the time you get to 2013, they're not really transferable skills. One of the things about, but Jamie Carragher's and Gary Neville have these interminable arguments over whose is the biggest club and whose is the better club between the two that they're associated with. And Carragher does use that argument, hey, we've won the league under more managers. But actually, when you look at Liverpool's success, post-war Jonathan, we will...
Which war, John?
Yes, World War II Jonathan. You look at it and it's Shankly to Paisley. Well, that's it's part of the same. And Joe Fagan, and then you've got Kenny Dalglish with Rob Paisley assisting him. It's part of the same thing. It's just that United had one figure doing the same thing. Now, Busby, one of the things with Busby is that he wasn't a great moderniser. He was when he came in. He was a first tracksuit manager. By the time he left the club, he was known as the old man. He was about 58, which is not that old in these days. Ferguson, of course, went into his 70s, but you have this sort of dominant figure, and it was, scouting was on the nod. He would getting a deal done with an agent. Well, get Ferguson on the line, you're probably going to be able to get the deal done. There's that story, isn't there, about Berbatov flying up to join Manchester City. He gets to the airport, Ferguson's waiting there, and his club Audi, get in the front seat, son. Off we go. And that's how it was done. That dominant figure. And now you can see the Ferguson, there is this idealisation of him, and you can see why, because he ran the club top to bottom. You can see the way that the players that played for him still don't dare stand up to him. When someone like that leaves an institution, it's going to struggle. And obviously, we go to the appointment of David Moyes, and I think all three of us were around at that time reporting on Manchester United, and you saw a man freeze, a man who is a good manager most of the time, saw him absolutely freeze and be unable to deal with this idea. And remember, there's that quote, isn't it, from Ferguson when he arrives in 1986, big club this, as he's saying to people, he keeps repeating it. He's like, Christ, I didn't realise how big this was. And I think that's happened to manager after manager after manager.
And even the appointment of Moyes shows the influence of Ferguson. That he's, the reason for appointing him is he's a continuity Scot. It's who's the closest thing we can see to Busby and Ferguson. It's Moyes, and of course it fails completely.
one story I heard on this, which is an interesting thing about the Ferguson myth or the Ferguson dominance of the club, is that David Moyes' father was a fairly influential coach up in Glasgow, and there is some story that back in the dim and distant past, in the late 50s, early 60s, Ferguson and Moyes Senior had some sort of dealings, and the fact that Ferguson was turned away by Mr. Moyes, and the fact that by the time you get to 2013, Ferguson was able to hand the keys to Moyes' son, to Mr. Moyes' son, was this sort of like Rosebud in Citizen Kane incident. This idea of like, I've gone back to claim what was mine, and all that is down to some sort of argument over Glaswegian representative football in the early 60s. And again, it's the Ferguson dominance, isn't it? That's the problem. Rory, sorry.
It's quite all right, don't worry. This was what I was hoping for, John. I wanted to allow you and Jonathan time to flourish, but I just wanted to kind of try and bring it back onto some sort of track. We have this established timeline then. Obviously, it goes without saying that the Glazers are not the sort of owners that a football team would want. Obviously, they take a lot of money out of the club. I'd actually contest Jonathan's assessment that if United had had that money available to spend on transfers, they'd be in a better place. My broader contention would be that they'd just have wasted more money, because what happens in 2013 is all of the... Look, someone's going to have that money. It might as well be in the Glazers' pockets. What happens in 2013, as one of you said, is that all kind of institutional football knowledge goes out the door. That Ferguson goes, and I think just as significantly, although it sounds like very much the sort of thing that a broadsheet journalist says and very few fans would care about, David Gill goes as well, who's the kind of the totemic chief executive, impeccably well connected, respected throughout the game. I think looking back, it's slightly odd that the Glazers did not say, as I believe that certainly the story around City has been over the last sort of year, 18 months, is that City have made it very clear that Chiki Bedirstein and Pep Guardiola are not leaving at the same time, that one of them stays because you need some sort of continuity. So I'm sure that if United had their time again, they'd have said, right, well, if Fergie's retiring in 2013, then David Gill, you're doing another year, maybe two. That's the deal. What do we think happens at that stage then? Is it that, and this has always been my interpretation, that United had fallen into that trap basically of confusing being a company effectively that employs a very talented line manager, which is what Ferguson effectively was, although maybe more than that in his case. They basically confused his virtues with their own, that they had taken it as read that Manchester United would always succeed, because they decided that kind of the success that they'd had was about the institution, whereas in reality it was just about one, and maybe in the form of David Gill, a second individual. That's something you see clubs do a lot. Had they basically decided that they succeeded by divine right, effectively?
Understood.
Yes, I think they probably had. I think there was probably a complacency there. I just think there's a lack of knowledge. They just don't know how to run a football club. Now, of course, running a football club changes over time. Yeah, I don't think if... I was about to say, I don't think if Ferguson was still there today, as a sort of 65-year-old, that he'd necessarily be doing particularly well. But of course, his great gift was he did evolve constantly. So maybe he would be doing fine. But you can't really run a modern football club through one man, and it's a familiar story that you have a great manager, he leaves, and especially when he's been there for 20 years or 26 years in Ferguson's 27 years in Ferguson's case, that there's a vacuum left and it's very difficult to fill. You've seen that at Arsenal with Arsene Wenger. You saw it at Dynamo Kiev with Valery Lobanovsky. A big long-term manager leaves, it's always going to be difficult. But you look at what they've done since, and none of the appointments really make sense. So continuity Scott, an elderly Van Gaal who could never be a long-term appointment, and it was sort of, he's done quite well at the World Cup, but he hadn't really done well at a big club team for quite a while. I know he'd won the Dutch league with AZ, but with a big club he hadn't done that, and he's such an idiosyncratic figure anyway that, I suspect. Well, I don't know what John thinks about this. I suspect most United fans don't agree with me on this, but I actually think Van Gaal has been the best post-Ferguson United manager.
I do agree with that, actually. Yes, yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. And well, listen, the football was bad to watch. It was boring. The weird thing with Van Gaal is, for someone who is so charismatic, he didn't really connect with the United fans. There was something about him that they didn't get, even though, in my experience, and maybe it's just this is a press thing. I've never been to a more entertaining press conference than a regular Van Gaal thing. It was always going to be amusing. You never knew what the guy was going to say, but you knew it was going to be forthright. You knew that he did not give a fuck what you thought, and it was absolutely incredible. But that was more entertaining. He should have just done press conferences rather than like run a football team. He was he was just incredible. But there were signs of progress under that team. But what happened was that as Rory said, it's a name we must mention. Ed Woodward is brought in as to replace David Gill. David Gill ended up being a football man. He had begun as a management consultant, an accountant. Similar trajectory for Ed Woodward, but he was much more a commercial guy. A commercial guy is brought in to run the football side, and for some reason they never turned to the Gill and Ferguson contacts book to get deals done. Remember this? I remember being myself and Miguel were in a hotel in Croatia talking about this Fabregas deal that was going to get done in the summer of 2013 that never ever happened because they couldn't get a contact to get this deal done. And so Woodward is brought in and he's just not able to get stuff done. But by 2016, he's got Jose Mourinho's number. And Miguel, of course, who will probably tell this tale far better, or did tell the tale, had this story of Mourinho, basically campaigning to get the Manchester United job. And they fell for these sweet nothings from Jose Mourinho, who arrived at United. And listen, speaking as a fan of Manchester United, that's about the time that I sort of had turned off because I actually don't mind Mourinho as a character in the game. I'm sort of glad he's around. I don't like to watch his football too often. I felt when he left English football back in 2007, the first time a sort of dark spell was lifted. But I do enjoy him being around. You need a dark side guy. He's good. He's good value. But United, he just turned up, didn't like what he saw, parked himself in a hotel. The team were okay, but still not that exciting. Then the bust-ups start coming with players, and he's not getting the players he wanted. And at that point, this is what the phrase that I used a lot at the time was Manchester United became just another club, whereas before it was Manchester United. You can't talk about that. That's Manchester United. Well, you can, because they're just another club that's maybe not doing as well as they should do.
I think the Mourinho appointment was, and our friend Ken earlier had this argument famously with Gary Neville on a stage in Dublin.
Yes.
But Ken, I think, was absolutely right that the appointment of Jose Mourinho was the appointment of somebody who doesn't know much about football. That it's not the analysis of, who is the rising manager, who is the person we get just before they peak. This is a famous man who's won stuff in the past. There's no analysis of why did it go wrong at Chelsea in the season after they'd won the league, why had it gone wrong by the end at Real Madrid. And I remember at the time thinking, that cup final when they beat Palace, Van Gaal's last game, and the news breaks literally as they're celebrating on the pitch that Mourinho's got the job. And I think this is really classless. Like, you should let Van Gaal have his moment. You don't destroy a moment of celebration by introducing a big new character like this. And I mean, you talk about press conference. Van Gaal walking in with the FA Cup, slamming it on the desk, and sort of this fury that he's just found out, and he's sort of Troost, his wife. Troost told me that they were going to sack me because the director's wife stopped talking to her, and I didn't believe it, but Troost was right. And it's just an amazing sort of farewell from Van Gaal. But sort of thinking even at the time, what are they doing? This is the act of a small club desperately grasping after somebody else's greatness. It's not the act of a great club. So when Tottenham I'm not calling Tottenham a small club. I'm saying that there are times when Daniel Levy has a slightly small club mentality, and the appointment of Mourinho, I think, was one of them. It sort of made sense for the personality of the people there in that club. It never made sense for United, and the doom was sort of pre-written from the start. You actually look back at it. Yeah, they finished second. They won the Europa League. Mourinho saying at the time, "This is my greatest achievement," and we all laughed. But you look at what's come since. It does look quite an achievement now.
There's also a Mourinho impact, isn't there? And I'd actually quibble with John's assertion that Mourinho is the dark side. I think increasingly it looks like in that Mourinho Guardiola sort of axis, Mourinho is the light. But
okay.
United.
Well, hang on. But his
podcast subject, yeah.
The criticism of Anders Frisk, waiting in a lift in Budapest or at the bottom of a lift in Budapest to attack Anthony Taylor, those are bad things.
Look, we're all
Like
people are complicated, Jonathan. But the all right. There's no excuse for that sort of business. But I think Mourinho is. This is a different debate. I think Mourinho is typecast in a certain way, and we decided that light and dark are far less mixed than they need to be. But anyway, it did strike me, I think in hindsight, I agree with you, that Mourinho's time at United is probably more of a success than it looked at the time, because we were still labouring under the illusion that Manchester United standards were those of the Ferguson Manchester United. But equally, I do think there's an interesting point from John that United lose something by becoming just another notch on Mourinho's bedpost. It's just like, it's just another job that he's taken, which in some way kind of through some weird like osmosis diminishes the club, not as being an ultimate destination. It's just kind of, it's Chelsea, it's PSG, it's whoever. It's just another team that sacks managers and hires managers and is enthralled to Mourinho and makes that kind of decision. I also wonder whether there is an element, if you go through the managerial history, that they were for a long time, probably up until Ten Hag, just trying to appoint bits of Alex Ferguson. So obviously Moyes, Scottish, Van Gaal, old. The Mourinho, successful and abrasive in press conferences. Like there were elements that they sort of thought, well, what was the bit about Ferguson that made him work? And that does speak to a club that doesn't have any. There's loads of ways of illustrating it, but doesn't have any strategy, doesn't have any kind of long-term vision beyond we're Manchester United, we're the biggest club in the world. That seems to be as far as anyone got, whether it's Woodward, who I think would present a slightly more positive case of his tenure than maybe a lot of people would, or even like Joel Glazer, who by all accounts is kind of into football. Like Joel Glazer really does. It's not a popular stance to take, but Joel Glazer apparently really cares about Manchester United and really likes football, will watch Championship football because he enjoys it. But if you look at every decision they've made, it is the kind of formula is Ferguson, so we need to get a bit of Ferguson. Let's get like a relic of Alex Ferguson, whether it's like his leg or his hair or whatever, and put that in charge and hope that works. Because until like day X, there has been nothing approaching a vision or a strategy.
With Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, of course, they had Ferguson's parking space as well. That famous.
But Solskjaer was the most egregious example of it, wasn't it? It was he is the boy who learned at the knee of the master. That we can't get Ferguson; he's now too old. So let's get a guy who maybe will just remember some stuff that Ferguson did.
Yeah, it was insane that, and so two things. One thing about Mourinho is, I would say, and I think all of us sat through this at the time, is anyone who watched late second period Chelsea under Mourinho and watched those press conferences. Remember, there's a 9-minuter. He was asking a 9-minute response to a question again when they lost to Southampton. I think I was sat with you, Jonathan.
Yeah, we were sat next to each other.
Yeah. And that was on the TV. And he did 9 minutes of the response, and someone actually typed that out, which I do remember. Whoever that was, thank you very much. And he came out and then did the same 9 minutes again of just ranting. And anybody that thought, this is the guy for us, within a few months of that, it was insane. But a probably perhaps madder decision was the Solskjaer on a full-time basis, which followed Mourinho thing. obviously the Paris Saint-Germain win, the Rashford penalty, and the Rio Ferdinand, Man United are back meme. That was just where things started to go really, really off key. And the thing is, but Manchester United still reached the Europa League final, still finished, seconds in leagues and stuff like that. What we've seen after that is like a real, the book is called Betrayal of a Legend, isn't it? From the early 80s. You are looking like a 70s style thing. I mean, no one's comparing Jose Mourinho to Franco Farrell, but, there is this sort of, again, the loneliness that Mourinho felt in Manchester United, that Farrell or Dave Sexton or one of these 70s managers felt, where they get to Manchester United and they feel like no one wants to know them, and that they don't want to know. It's such a hard club to manage. The size of it, the pressure, the living in Manchester, which obviously Mourinho didn't take to. Then you have this thing where they start signing all these players that start complaining about living in Manchester, and it's that would not have happened in the Ferguson era, would it? If someone complains about living in Manchester, it's like, you're not going to last that long. It's just the. So then the stories, the leaks and stuff like that. Back in the Ferguson days, most of the stories came from the desk of Sir Alex Ferguson, and he wanted the stories out there because he had people that would feed those stories to people. These days, it's you've had where team selections have been leaked and suddenly people are banned and all this type of thing. It's just, it's a farcical situation.
But the Solskjaer appointment, I think that was the confirmation that there is no analytical thinking there. That giving him the job immediately after Mourinho is a sort of to clean it up. After all this toxicity, all this negativity, slagging off Marcus Rashford, bring in somebody who's utterly devoted to the club. You're a true believer. As a happy. Relic, the term you use, Rory, I think it's the right word. There is something almost quasi-religious about it. This relic of the glorious past. And it does detoxify the situation actually remarkably quickly. So on an emotional level, that was a very good appointment. But you had him on a contract till the end of the season. This is Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. He's not going to go to another club. If another club had come in that March, April, May and said, actually, Ollie, it looks like you might be quite good as a manager, despite what we saw at Cardiff, despite what we saw at Mulder. Actually, he did all right at Mulder, didn't he? That's a bit unfair. But despite what we saw at Cardiff, here's a contract. For one person in the world who's never going to walk away from United is Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. So why give him the job full-time before the end of the season? You could have waited, got extra I can't remember, was it 8 weeks, 10 weeks of data? And of course, by the time you've got that extra 2.5 months of data, it's obvious that he's not actually as good as he looked at first. That once that detoxification effect, once that instant impact is over, there's not much there. But it's just this sort of, they're scrabbling around looking for a messiah, which kind of makes sense with the DNA of a club. The fact that it has been these two sort of messianic figures who have been able to tame the wild horse. But there's no sort of thought of how do we put processes in place to make this work. It's just looking for an individual who can make it work. And maybe this guy's got the magic. Maybe it's Mourinho because he's been a winner in the past. Maybe it's Solskjaer because he represents the past of the club. And then they turn to technocrats, but you can't just appoint a technocrat. You have to appoint a technocracy and build a technocracy. And that A, takes ages, B, it's quite boring, and C, it's really hard to do. And they keep changing their minds on how that technocracy should look every sort of 18 months. And we end up in a situation where they're finishing 15th. Their worst finish since they were relegated in 1974.
What's interesting about the sort of rise of the United technocracy, and I can't remember which of our colleagues made this point. It might have been Tarek, it could have been Jack, or it may have been Ken Early. That they kind of they approach that transformation in a really Man United way. So it's just, can we find famous people to be our technocrats? It's kind of, well, let's get the guy from Man City. He'll be really good. Like it hasn't, even from the outside, you kind of think, well, they are making, like, it's really boring. And I know that there's a lot of fans probably quite rightly think it's a very kind of, it's evidence of the middle classification of football that we've kind of, raised this class of executive to superstar status. But they are genuinely important. It is genuinely important to have good people running a football club. That is significant. These people they have considerable power. They make decisions that define the way a kind of club operates in the transfer market, in the managerial transfer market. Like, they are figures of genuine significance, even if there's I think an episode that we did on the celebrity sporting director that I think punches a lot of the myth making around them. But they are genuinely important. But United's approach appeared to be, let's get the ones we've heard of so that we can kind of persuade the fans that because we've appointed the most famous people, we must have appointed the best. It's not. I think those structures are often arise kind of organically. If you look at, Brighton, Brentford, Liverpool, the three clubs that are held up as being the best in class, even Arsenal to an extent pre Andrea Berta, there's an element of the organic about those behind the scenes structures. United's was very much like, we need to get some technocrats in. Let's get the ones that are in the papers all the time, that people have heard of, or that have already got kind of best in class employers. And lo and behold, it hasn't worked. To the extent that the modern Manchester United, as you say, finished 15th last season, but they do so against this backdrop of like a remarkable run of bad publicity for strange decisions related to big Sir Jim Ratcliffe and his cost-cutting measures, which involve not feeding normal staff members, a load of redundancies. I read in one paper today that, in fact, it may be in The Athletic, that the cost cutting was designed to direct as much money as possible towards the recruitment arm of the club. And you think, well, look, how many people are you firing to pay £65 million to Brentford for Bryan and Mbeumo? Like, that feels like that's a weird way to run a business. Ratcliffe was dressed up as the kind of almost like the modern version of a Red Knight, boyhood fan, trying to buy Chelsea, determined to kind of right the ship, make everything kind of work again. And yet, John, it does look as though, a year, 18 months into Jim Ratcliffe's revolution, this is the weakest United have ever been.
Yeah, I mean, initially, the fact that he wasn't a Glazer was the best thing going for Big Sir Jim, and it's still the best thing going for him at this point, because it's been disastrous in the sense of his own PR has been pretty awful. He seems to be reasonably ill-fated in the world of sport. Let's take an example. His Ineos team actually won a stage of the Tour de France just at the weekend. But at the same time, his driver managed to smash over a spectator, an Ineos car. These sort of pratfalls appear to happen to the Ineos sporting empire. I mean, you had the stuff with the America's Cup as well, where they get to the final, get completely gubbed by New Zealand. There's a big fallout with Sir Ben Ainsley, and so Jim was again one of these saviours that was going to come in, but he's operated it in this almost in the style of a Mike Ashley or someone like that. I remember how popular he was on Tyneside for that, and maybe there is a case for cost cutting. Maybe because of the Glazers, they were filling their satchels. They were quite happy for everybody else to carry on. It's true to say that Manchester United was not a success in those 10 years before Big Sir Jim came in. But the way he's handled it is not the way it's done in football circles. That sort of tight family background that Ferguson left has been ripped apart, and the heart of the club, the void at the heart of the club, has grown larger as a result of his involvement there. And the thing is, it's not as if Big Jim doesn't want to succeed. He obviously does, but he almost wants to succeed too hard. I mean, we had this story over the weekend, didn't we? That, Omar Barada and who was the other executive? Jason Wilcox are invited to go fly fishing in Iceland with Jim. You've got to live this. I think Ken Early said, it's like a scene from Succession. Like it's the way this stuff sort of carries on. It's ludicrous. It's nothing to do with the football club. Is the sort of set pieces of a billionaire? Are they turning things over in a football sense? When you actually see Big Jim answer questions like Gary Neville did, quite a reasonable attempted Jeremy Paxman on him. his answers were not credible. And the fact is that the business people have taken over Manchester United, like the Glazers, like Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and the football people are way down the list of the people running the club. And someone like Dan Ashworth, who, if you speak to people within the game, a guy that likes to set up processes that take a while to get going, he arrives at the club, he's a misfit, and he leaves the club immediately. And it's just disaster after disaster. And you begin to wonder, at what point does it turn? And at this point, it's very difficult to find that snagging point of when it's going to revive itself.
Well, Ashworth left, didn't he, because of a disagreement over the appointment of Ruben Amorim?
Yes.
And Ruben Amorim, I think, is another great example of people who don't really get football doing something and not really understanding why they're doing it. They look at Ruben Amorim, great record at Sporting, very charismatic, clearly a very good coach, but he plays this 3-4-3 or 3-4-2-1, and anybody who knows football looks at that United squad and goes, there's about 90% of those players either have never played that system before or will never be able to play that system. And the idea that might be a problem seems to have occurred to nobody at the club apart from Dan Ashworth, who pays for it with his job. And that's the problem, that football is a very specific business, and if you don't understand it, then you'll never succeed in it. I think Daniel Levy's another example of this. That he's somebody who, from a business point of view, has been extremely successful at Tottenham. That's a business that makes money. The stadium is an astonishing achievement, but the football side of things doesn't really function. And the problem that everybody has, and quite rightly has, is a football club is actually about the football. And if you don't get the football right, then the very visible thing, the thing that's been broadcast to millions of people on TV, the thing that thousands of people turn to watch, if that's going wrong, you get mass protests. And nobody actually cares if you're making a 23% profit or whatever it is.
I think we'll leave that there for now. There's one other aspect of the United demise that I just want to touch on a little bit, which we'll do after this largely unnecessary break. So I just wanted to broaden this out a little bit because I find this really interesting, and it touches on kind of what you mentioned there, Jonathan, about Amorim and the squad, and this summer of churn yet again at Manchester United. They've obviously signed two players already, Matheus Cunha and Brian Mbeumo, one of whom I think is a good signing, and they've got a bomb squad, I believe is now the accepted phrase, of players that they have left behind from their pre-season tour. They're not welcome. Don't come, Terrell Malacia. You're the problem. So it's Malacia, Jadon Sancho, who we think might be about to join Juve, Marcus Rashford, who I think, as we speak, and by the time this goes out, may well have signed for Barcelona. Here we go. And there's Anthony and somebody else. Oh, Garnacho, who's the most interesting one, I think. And the reason I find Garnacho the most interesting is that I think he is indicative of the situation that United find themselves in now. And I think it's a really difficult trap to get out of, which is that Alejandro Garnacho is a good footballer. There is no debate in that. He is a good player. He will be, for the next 10 or 12 years or whatever, he will be a regular starter for a good team in one of Europe's 5 major leagues. I think we can all agree on that. That is Alejandro Garnacho's destiny. He is better at football than billions of people. But I think it's also true to say that he's maybe not the sort of player around whom you can build a title-winning team. I don't think Alejandro Garnacho gets into the Liverpool team that won the league last year. I don't think he gets into any of the classic United teams under Ferguson if they were updated for the modern day. And that, I think, is sort of illustrates the trap that United are in, which is it's really, really hard to separate the 7 out of 10 players who aren't the problem at the team. They're not your weak links. They're not your kind of your obvious spots that you have to improve. It's really hard for clubs to understand that you actually have to get rid of those players as well. And United, I think the problem has been they have got, across that team, there are loads of players who you'd look at and say that is not the obvious problem, but there are very few players who you don't look at and say that's not the obvious problem, if that makes sense. They are a squad of, well, he's not the weak link. And I think that is the issue that they've got themselves in now, where you have this team that basically you need to start again and in football you can't.
Well, you can't start again in the modern football way of, because it costs too much. We've already discussed the price of Mbeumo, a player I've seen play an awful lot, who I think is very, very good, but I do wonder whether he is the standard of an elite club. And if the other thing is that because people know that big Sir Jim Ratcliffe is desperate, the price goes up. There is a Manchester United tariff placed there. It's not like the old days of, the 70s or 80s where you could just almost ship out a whole team and bring in a new team. I mean, having said that, and when United did that first time under Ferguson, which would be back in the summer of '89, they wobbled horrendously and had to rescue themselves with an FA Cup. It wasn't that easy back then. It's even harder now. And when you've had all that natural wastage, or not this natural, it's the opposite of natural. When you've had all that wastage, you've got a problem that the players that would have joined Manchester United because they're Manchester United aren't around anymore. You're looking to a lower tranche of player to join the club. Manchester United are not a credible destination for Alexander Isak should he come up for sale, for example. The major players out there that might come on the market are going to look at Manchester United and say, well, every player that's joined them since Ashley Young has turned out to be absolutely rubbish. They're not going to go there. So rebuilding that makes it even more difficult.
Well, I think
Garnacho as well. Sorry.
So I just quickly, I think even in Mbeumo, they've only really got because he's a Man United fan. Like he said, I think on his unveiling that he wore that shirt as a kid, which I believe in. In his case, I'm inclined to believe.
Of course, yeah.
The chances are, if you're trying to do that with any other player, you're not going to have that advantage. The sensible decision from Mbeumo probably would have been to go to Newcastle. They're in the Champions League. They're a club on the up. I'm sure it would have been able to agree a fee with Brentford, but he made it clear he only wanted to sign for United, and he did that because he's a United fan. So you're trying to trade in on that mythology. You're not kind of selecting players because they are the right sort of fit and level and moment for you. And the problem will be that maybe not with Mbeumo, but I certainly suspect with Cunha, that in 3 or 4 years' time, if United have got back on the right track, you don't have to upgrade Matheus Cunha as well. So you just get sort of, that's what I mean by it being a trap. You're just sort of you're running in a circle because you're constantly trying to upgrade 7 out of 10 players by replacing them with 7 out of 10 players. Jonathan?
Well, I think Garnacho is part of another trap, which is United's academy, although it's been underfunded over the last decade, 15 years or so, and is probably not as productive as it has been. It still does produce players. But then young players at the club, enormous pressure is put on them. So you look at something like Kobbie Mainoo, who comes through, is clearly a really, really good midfielder, but suddenly at 18 is the future of United. Garnacho, Adnan Januzaj it happened with. Amad Diallo to an extent, and he sort of rediscovered himself out on loan. I mean, he was brilliant on loan at Sunderland, and I'm really glad that he's, until the injury, was sort of showing his true form at United. But suddenly you get these kids. I mean, Garnacho's only 21 still, who, and not just you're a promising kid, you'll play 10, 15 games a season for one of the biggest clubs in the world, and hopefully you'll develop, and in 2 or 3 years you're a regular. Suddenly you are the Messiah. Suddenly you're the person who has to lead this club back, and that's an astonishing amount of pressure to put on anybody, but particularly on a kid. And so, I mean, I don't know, would Januzaj have had a better career if he'd started out somewhere else? Possibly, but his career was almost ended before it begun by being the future of Manchester United, because there's this desperation to find a figure, whether that's a manager or a bright young player, who can drag them back. But but the thing that will drag them back is 5 years, 10 years of process and slow incremental improvement.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, the thing is with the I was going to say the thing is with the young stars of Manchester United that have come through. The players that the Busby Babes, the George Bests, and all this, and even the team. The class of '92. The class of '92, the team that won the title, the Fergie's fledglings, you look at them, and actually they were playing with a lot of experienced players. You had Steve Bruce, you had Gary Pallister, you had Peter Schmeichel, you had Roy Keane, who's slightly older. You had those players to pull them through. At Manchester United, there aren't those players. Even back with the Busby Babes, they had Alan B. Chilton to play alongside them or whatever. It was, it's that there are, there's the idea in football of like leaders in the team and stuff like that, which is sometimes a nebulous concept. But who are the players that you look to? You've got Bruno Fernandes, and that's just about it within the team. And Bruno Fernandes himself is one of those players that you would have thought that if Manchester United were pushing for the elite, a manager is going to have to take a decision on him because he wants his own ball too often, if you see what I mean. But it's a long way to get to that point.
I'm really interested in Fernandes because I know that I'm maybe on the in the minority on this, but I feel as though Fernandes is kind of one of those 7 out of 10 players. He's maybe an 8 out of 10 player, but I don't know if you can build a title-winning team around Bruno Fernandes, which is, I don't think it'll be relevant. By the time United are back in a position to win the title, Bruno Fernandes will be in his mid-30s at best case scenario. But he's almost indicative of it too, that there's all this hype around Bruno, but I'm not sure that Real Madrid or Liverpool or Manchester City are looking at Bruno and thinking, I wish we could sign him. I just don't really think that's a thing that happens. I did want to ask, and we should maybe end it on this, to what extent, like we've been talking about United as this sort of miasmic institution that has these wants and desires, to what extent when we say that, do we mean the media? Is it not us that are putting the pressure on Garnacho or the expectations on Mainu or building up Fernandes to be kind of this potential messiah when we should kind of know better?
I guess it depends how you define media, which is a changing thing. But I think particularly fan media allows us to see not necessarily the accurate voice of 100% of fans, but it is a way for fans to express their opinion in a much more overt way than in the late 80s or 90s when you had photocopied fanzines. So it partly comes from that. Yeah, partly probably the media more generally is responsible. But the media is also reactive to its audience. This is one of the enduring fascinations of Manchester United, that no matter how bad they are, you still get more traction for writing something about Manchester United than you do about anybody else. And there's almost, me as a complete neutral, I find that period between winning the European Cup and, let's say, winning the FA Cup under Tommy Docherty, that 9-year period, arguably the most interesting period of any club in the history of the world. How on earth is, George Best wins his last trophy in 1968? It's 21.
Or whatever, yeah.
How can they go in 6 years from being European champions to relegated? And of course, John referenced earlier that Busby by the end was very conservative. It was John Aston, wasn't it, who's man of the match in that final, who said it was like winning Wimbledon with a wooden racket. That technology, the game has moved on, but United did it the old way. And that's one of the reasons. Busby was 58, 59 when he retired the following year. Obviously, Munich has taken a toll on him, so effectively he's older than that. But he's notably an old-fashioned figure by then, and that's sort of what causes that. But what's fascinating then is, how is this repeated? How has this happened again? How is this part of United's DNA that 45 years later, they go from a period when they were in 3 Champions League finals in 4 years, ending in 2011, to finishing 15th now in an era when big clubs should never fall that far. When resources are so important. United, I was about to say United are never going to get relegated, but it's actually not totally. It's a 0.001% chance, but there is a chance they could be in relegation trouble this season.
I was going to say that what will happen, that people will say, why are you still talking about Manchester United? That's the response you get from people that would rather Manchester United hadn't existed at all. They may come from the Stockport postcode or Liverpool or whatever. You always get this, why are you still talking about Manchester United? But as Jonathan said, probably the biggest story of the 70s in football was the fall of Manchester United, rather than Liverpool and Leeds being absolutely brilliant football teams. In the 80s, Liverpool were the brilliant football team, but Manchester United still dominated because of that glamour, because of that soap opera, that or it's almost like the Kennedys or something like that of football. That's the Manchester United story of just this faded glamour, and tragedy is involved as well. And what's going on now is by no means a tragedy, but it is it is, as you said at the start, it's decline and fall, and it's fascinating. And it's fascinating for everyone to watch. It's fascinating for everyone to watch, like, how much money can you waste and be still so bloody useless? It's TV that you can't turn off. It's rubbernecking at the absolute fall of a giant.
And I think what has been genuinely extraordinary, this idea that money should provide this safety net. I think if the Glazers had come in 20 years ago and said, how do we destroy Manchester United? They could not have done it any more efficiently than this. Because you have to, if they come in and just started selling people and pulling down the stadium, there'd have been a great uprising against them. But by letting them have that success, by letting that hangover continue, by letting the post-Ferguson period go on, people go, they're actually all right the last few years. And then the slow decline, spending money, but spending it badly, letting everything just decay, letting Old Trafford decay, letting the academy decay, letting press facilities decay, letting recruitment decay, letting everything at the club just slowly sink. And that's why, I think on Friday we're going to talk about other clubs who find themselves in similar positions, and I don't want to preempt that, but obviously you can look at Germany, where enormous clubs are currently in the Zweite Bundesliga, and Hamburg have just come back up. So huge clubs have gone down there, and huge clubs maybe are much harder to turn around than smaller clubs. They have more inertia, more some momentum. But I think we're now in totally uncharted territory with United. I don't think in the modern era we've seen a club that big be that bad, and you do wonder, can it get any? It probably won't, but it could get even worse than this.
They were meant to be too big to fail, as noted seer and wordsmith Mark Ogden once put it. The thing that I would add to that is that I think United play quite an important moral role. That there's a parable element to Manchester United, and in an era when football is basically defined by money. Roger Bennett, who I work with in the US, kind of one of his phrases is, "We are cheering for spreadsheets." That is what is happening when in club football. It's kind of who's got the best spreadsheet, and you look at a lot of the arguments around Alexander Isak and Newcastle, and their basic theory is we should be able to have the best spreadsheet, and therefore we should win lots of football matches. That is what they want to happen. United remind us that because they have spent an awful lot of money, it's not just about money. They are a kind of little warning: you need to do this well, because if you don't, this is what can happen. And on that salutary note, I know we've been accused on Libero of always ending on episodes on these massive downers, so I apologise. If it's any help, if you're not a Man United fan, you will really have enjoyed that hour of audio content, because there's the great thing about United is that, and I remember when you set up it was what it was, Jonathan, that I remember thinking how smart it was that your first episode, or one of the early ones, was on the decline of United in the 70s. United being relegated, I think, was one of the early episodes. And I remember thinking oh no, it wasn't. It was the Mark Robbins thing. It was Mark Robbins in '89 saving Fergie's job. I remember thinking that was the perfect pitch for an audience, because you get the United fans who want to hear the origin story of their greatness, and everyone else to listen to it and think, God, it was brilliant when United were crap. So hopefully we've hit the same tone here. As we say, the others will be back on Friday to look at kind of how United get out of it, if they can get out of it, but also to put it in the context of AC Milan, Inter Milan, Juve, Hamburg, Schalke, whoever you want. Horncastle's on. We're not allowed to call him horny anymore. It upsets people. Horncastle's on, so you will be hearing people say the word Italy like an Italian. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to John and to Jonathan. If anyone's been watching on YouTube, sorry that I've been a disembodied voice. My Wi-Fi's not great. I'm in a cottage on the coast. And we'll see you very soon.